As kingdom citizens, God has given us a certain code of conduct to live by. When the nation of Israel came out of Egypt, God gave them the 10 Commandments and actually roughly 2,000 other commands. And what we saw last week is that all of God's commands are for our good. They're to protect us, and they're also to distinguish us from other people in the world who don't know and don't follow God. So all of God's commandments are for our good. And at the very top of the list we're going to see today is the command that we make God number one in our lives. So we start out today with a partial reading of Psalm 119. King David wrote Psalm 119, and King David did his fair share of breaking God's commands over the course of his life. But as he did that, as he suffered the consequences, as he learned to walk in God's ways, he came to realize that following God's law, God's way, was his top priority. Let me read for you some of Psalm 119. Psalm 119, verses 2 through 8. David says this: "How blessed are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord. How blessed are those who observe his testimonies, who seek him with all their heart. They also do no unrighteousness. They walk in his ways. You have ordained your precepts that we should keep them diligently. Oh, that my ways may be established to keep your statutes. Then I shall not be ashamed when I look upon all your commandments. I shall give thanks to you with uprightness of heart when I learn your righteous judgments. I shall keep your statutes. Do not forsake me utterly." You know, God's commandments, they reveal his character. The fact that he's holy, that he's righteous, that he's just, and that he's pure. So we're going to look at the first two commandments today, but just getting started, have you ever thought about it this way? What would be the opposite of some of the 10 commandments? You want to get God's character. You know, God says, do not murder, right? But what, maybe the opposite of that, maybe in some, alternative culture, maybe that command would be something like the strongest survive, right? It could have been that. God's command, God says, do not commit adultery. What if in some other culture the command was, do whatever feels good, right? What if God says, do not lie? What if in another culture the leader said, do whatever it takes to get ahead, right? When you frame it up that way, you see the 10 Commandments reveals God's character. He's holy, he's righteous, he's just, and he's pure in every way. So God gives the nation of Israel the 10 Commandments, right? Jesus is gonna expound on that in the Sermon on the Mount. But quite frankly, I'm impressed that God was able to keep it to 10. I have 4 kids, and over the course of our family's lifetime, I have about 8,000 commands in my home. All sorts of things I never knew I was going to have to say, right? But God has boiled down for us the essence. And of course, Jesus did that in the New Testament too. He said, listen, you really want to understand it? Love God and love others. And so today we're going to talk about that portion. What does it mean to love God? And God has plenty to say about that in the 10 Commandments. The very first commandment is this: you are to have no other gods before him. In Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 3, God says this: I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Out of the house of slavery, you shall have no other gods before me. Now, don't miss this. Do you see what God said at the very start of the 10 Commandments? God said this: I am the Lord your God. Do you see what God said to Israel? You know what he was saying? You have a God. You don't have a God. You have the God, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. He's saying, Israel, I am your God. Don't miss that. He says, I'm the God who brought you out of your slavery. All of the trouble and the strife and the sadness and the misery of your life, I brought you out of that. I am your God. That's the first statement in the 10 Commandments. So God says, I've done all that for you. Now, you are to have no other gods beside me. Understand that when the nation of Israel came out of Egypt, they had only known slavery for 400 years. They didn't have leadership. They didn't have any way to govern themselves. They didn't know what it meant to be a healthy society. So God said, I'm going to give you commands to order and structure your society, right? So historically, they're slaves in Egypt. Egypt is a fascinating culture to study, but it's very pagan and very lost. Egypt had over 2,000 gods. There were gods for safe travel. There were gods for digestion. There were just gods for everything. And each god was worshipped. And so Israel's coming out of a culture where there's more than 2,000 gods being worshipped. And God calls them out and he says, let's get first things first. I am the one true and only God, and you're to worship me, and you're to worship me alone. God was doing more than just taking them out of slavery. He was giving them a life where they could thrive, right? So an obvious kind of challenge for us, and you guys will talk about this in a few minutes, but let me bring this out because Scripture kind of puts this on me when I read this. So Israel lived in a culture that worshiped gods that were no gods at all, and they picked those up and they brought them with them, and God had to shed that from them. How about you? And how about me in the culture we live in? Have you picked up any false gods that you're worshiping? And I'm not talking about birds or stars or cattle. I'm talking about things that are more subtle that come from our culture. Things like success, things like power, things like accumulation, things like career. So these are all, kind of modern day, what we could call gods that we, if we're not careful, we begin to worship. There's nothing wrong with being successful. There's nothing wrong at all with being ambitious in a career. All the work we do, we should work unto the Lord. But there's a problem if that becomes a god, right? So Israel had picked up false gods in their culture. And it causes me to ask the question, have I picked up any false gods in my culture? So bear this in mind. Your God is that which you are prepared to give all of your time, strength, and obedience. This is why the Apostle John said this in 1 John 5:21. He says this, "Dear children, keep away from anything that might take God's place in your hearts." Command number 1 in the kingdom contract is you are to have no other gods beside him. And then it's very interesting. The second command, it almost feels like the same thing, but it's a little bit different. God says this in Exodus 20, verse 4. He says this, "You shall not make for yourselves an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters under the earth." It's similar, but it's different. It's almost like God saying, in case you didn't quite understand it the way I said it the first time, let me say it to you a little differently this time, right? He's saying, don't let any idols get between me and my relationship with you. So again, historically for the nation of Israel, this was a huge struggle for them. Like Israel, you follow the story of the Old Testament. All through the Old Testament, they struggled with idolatry, with the worship of false gods that were from other cultures that lived around them and near them and with them. And so here's what God did in this second commandment for Israel. He identified their number one issue. And he said, listen, we're going to deal with this right off the bat. You're not to make any idols. Now, I'll be honest, for me, the idea of worshiping an idol, something made of stone or wood, that's no temptation to me at all. But again, we're talking modern day. What would a modern day idol be for me? It's not going to be a cow or a calf. Obviously, the nation of Israel, the calf and the bull were worshipped in Egypt. What do they do at Mount Sinai while Moses is getting the 10 Commandments? They make a golden calf and they worship it. They're worshiping a false idol. For them, it was number one, and God identified it. But here's the discussion in your group today, or maybe it's too personal. And maybe you're going to maybe not hit that directly, but maybe you're going to journal this later on in your time with the Lord. What's your number one issue? What's the number one idol in your life? Because again, for us, idols, they can be a lot of things. Money can be an idol. Fame can be an idol. Success, these things can be idols. If we pursue them and they get in between us and our pursuit of God, then it's an idol. A very subtle example of this would be Abraham. Abraham had a son, Isaac. He loved his son so much. When you really study the story, Isaac had become an idol to Abraham. And God said, Abraham, I've given you Isaac. He's a blessing and a treasure to you, but he's not to become an idol. You're to worship me and then love your son. But his worship of Isaac had gotten in the way. It's a story you can study, but anything can be an idol. Here's how you can know, like, is money an idol for you? I don't have any idea, but here's one way you can check. You know, if you're, you know, blessed to the point where you've got a savings account, you've got retirement, you've got some things that you really like, and you really feel peaceful about your life, if somehow, some way those things were to be taken away, if you didn't have that cushion, that 3-month cushion in your savings account, if for some reason that all disappeared, would you be able to sleep at night, or would you be stressed? Because I would say if you would be stressed, if you lost your joy and you lost your peace because that savings account was gone, I would say you were trusting in your savings account more than you were trusting in God. Just a concept to consider when we talk about idolatry, because we need to take this out of ancient Israel where they worshiped rocks and stones and wood, and we need to bring it into the present day. Very important to God. I'm going to ask it again. What's your number one issue? God identified it for them. What's yours? These are the first two elements. God is right off the bat. What we're going to see is the first 4 commandments deal with our relationship to God. And then the last 6 deal with our relationship with others. What did Jesus say? Remember? You want to sum the whole thing up? Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And God says, make no mistake about it. I am the one and only true God. You are to worship me and worship me alone. Now, what I want you guys to do is have a great conversation about how we can practically do that in our everyday lives. Have a great conversation.